time, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the FHWA webinar, Local Public Agency Experiences and Transition Plan Implementation. This is the third of 4 webinars in the series, Transitioning to a More Accessible Tomorrow. My name is Brad Allen. I'm a consultant with Applied Pavement Technology, or AppTech, and we are proud to be supporting FHWA in this very important effort. For this webinar, our participants will be on mute. If you would like to ask a question to one of our speakers or raise a concern regarding issues with the webinar, please use the chat box to inform your host. You can locate the chat in the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can access, we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can by the end of the webinar. Closed captioning is being provided. If you wish to view the closed captioning, please expand the CC button, again on the bottom ribbon at the bottom of your Zoom window, and select Show Subtitles. You can also view a complete transcript from a separate window by choosing View Full Transcript from the same menu. An ASL interpreter is also being provided for this webinar. If you have any questions about the functionality of the Zoom meeting platform, please visit the website shown on this screen. This link will also be shared in the chat. Please note the written disclaimer I've placed in the chat box. To summarize, by attending or speaking in today's virtual workshop on local public agency experiences in transportation plan implementation, you consent to be audio recorded by FHWA and its agents. Further, by attending or speaking in the virtual workshop, you also authorize FHWA to use for educational, promotional, or any other purposes, recordings of or by you, by FHWA without further notice or consent. By attending or speaking in the virtual workshop, you release FHWA and its agents from any liability arising out of use of any such recording. Please review the full written disclaimer, which again, we've placed in the chat box. Recordings of all 4 of the webinars, including today's, will be made public by FHWA at a later date. Watch FHWA's YouTube channel for the videos to be posted. Just a note before we get started, the 4th and final webinar in the series, Disability Advisory Group's Involvement in Transition Plan Implementation, will be held next week, on July 21st, again from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll share the link to register for that webinar in the chat window at the end of today's session. And with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Melissa Anderson of FHWA's Office of Civil Rights. Melissa?
Thank you, Brad. Welcome to Federal Highway's ADA Virtual Exchange on ADA Transition Plan Implementation for Local Public Agencies. My name is Melissa Anderson. I'm an ADA Program Analyst from the Federal Highway Administration Office of Civil Rights, and I'll be facilitating today's session. So as Brad said, this is our 3rd webinar in a series of 4. Our webinar series has focused on noteworthy practices of various stakeholders in support of efforts of local public agencies to implement their transition plans and to comply with the ADA requirements. Today's session will focus on how 2 local agencies have been successfully implementing their ADA transition plans. Today, you will hear from Dawn Gardner, AICP ADAC Transportation Planner, ADA Coordinator from the City of Springfield, Missouri. And also you'll hear from Emily Burns, PMP Asset Management Strategic Advisor from the City of Seattle, Washington. So before we get started, we are going to have a quick poll. So we ask that you select what type of agency you represent. And some of the choice of Federal Highway, another federal agency. We'll actually launch it so you can see it. Federal highway, another federal agency, state DOT, other state agencies, MPOs, local county government, academic, or consulting, or other. So we'll give you just a minute to do that. And looks like our numbers have kind of stabilized. So we have the majority of people are from local and county government. So that's wonderful. That's who we're talking about today. So thank you for participating. Thank you for participating in the poll. I'm going to introduce Dawn now. So today you'll hear from Dawn Gardner. Dawn is the transportation planner and ADA coordinator for the city of Springfield, Missouri. She developed a passion for advocating for people with disabilities while working for the Missouri Department of Transportation. And she worked there for 19 years as the transportation planning coordinator in the Springfield district office. She began working at the city of Springfield in 2012 and soon began the process of developing the city's first ADA transition plan. Through this effort, she has improved communication with local disability advocates and now partners with them to continue to move the implementation of the transition plan forward. Dawn holds a BS and a master's degree in public administration from the Missouri State University, and she's a certified planner through the American Planning Association. So please welcome Dawn Gardner. And Dawn, if you want to go ahead and share your presentation.
Okay, is that up? Can everybody see it?
So can you go to display settings and hit duplicate screen, I think?
So you can't see it?
We see
Not-
both your presentation and your slide.
Oh.
If you go to display settings, yeah, right where your cursor is,
In the middle there.
and then hit swap monitors. There you go.
Interesting. That has never happened to me before. Okay. So everything looks good. Good. Okay. Thank you, Melissa, for the great introduction. I, again, am Dawn Gardner, and I am from Springfield, Missouri. And I am very honored to be able to present our implementation plan today. We've worked very hard on it for several years, and yeah, we are going hot and heavy in it. And hopefully I will provide some great information for you all and some lessons learned from us, so maybe you don't repeat them as you implement your plans. Okay, just a little bit about Springfield. We are the third largest city in Missouri, of course, after St. Louis and Kansas City. Those are the two most well-known cities in Missouri. We are located in the southwest part of the state. If you've heard of Branson, Missouri, we are 30 minutes north of Branson. Our population is approximately 168,000. However, in the daytime, we have a lot of commuters from surrounding areas that commute into Springfield for work and other things. So our daytime population reaches about 252,000. And then our metropolitan statistical area is 475,000. So we have a pretty big area, but just within our city limits, we are at 168,000. And our city limits are at 82 square miles. I wanted to give you all a little bit of background about how we got to where we are today. as Melissa stated, I came to the city in 2012 as the city's first transportation planner, as well as being assigned the ADA coordinator. So it took me a couple of years to convince management that we don't have a real transition plan. Where is it at? Well, I always got, well, we've done inventories before. We know what we have. We know how many miles of sidewalk we have. Well, that's not a transition plan. So I finally was able to convince that we actually have to have a transition plan in place. So then it took a few more years for me to be able to convince that I just can't be one person and go out and inventory our sidewalk system and our ramps. So we finally were able to get a consultant in place that did our inventory collection and assessment, and that began in December of 2018. They were able to complete their inventory of our sidewalk system in July of 2018, which took about 3 months longer because, of course, we had one of the rainiest springs we've ever had, and they didn't get to do a lot of data collection for a few months. So after we received our data, our contractor, our consultant, and us worked together to analyze it, to import it into our GIS system, and then I wrote the plan myself. We did not hire them to write our plan. So our plan was finally done and adopted by City Council in December of 2019, and we began plan implementation in January of 2020. And of course, we all know what hit in 2020, so I'll talk about that a little bit later, how that affected our implementation. So what were the results of our inventory and assessments? What we have on the screen in front of you is a bar chart showing the condition ratings of our sidewalks. We have a total of 640 miles of sidewalk. 60% of our sidewalk system is below good condition. And based on the factors that we gave the consultant, anything below good condition is not compliant. So we have a pretty good section of our sidewalk that is out of existing ADA compliance. Then we have the results of our assessment for our ramps. This slide is showing a pie chart of our ramps. We have a total of 10,297 curb ramps, and 70% of those are non-compliant ramps. The consultant broke our ramps out by how many are not compliant, period, how many are compliant, but to an older standard, how many are compliant to current standard, partially compliant, and especially where there is no ramp, but one is required, which we all know that is a huge violation of the ADA. So anything that is not compliant is 70% and below, and that includes compliant but to an older standard, because we want everything to the current standard. The costs to bring everything to compliance, meaning our sidewalks and our curb ramps, was $30 million. It's interesting that 15 million was bringing our sidewalks up to standard, and the other 15 million is the estimate for our ramps. So it was broken out evenly as far as cost goes. And the chart that you're looking at now is an inventory and assessment of our traffic signals. We have 142 traffic signals in the city of Springfield, and 56% of those are not audible, or were not at the time of our transition plan, which was 2019 was when it was when it was completed and adopted. So our traffic signals are separate from, I mean, they're in our transition plan, but our traffic signal department, they pretty much have their own separate plan on bringing all of them up to compliance by year. They have their own budget and they have their own replacement system. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about our funding sources. Our primary funding sources in the city of Springfield are our quarter-cent capital improvement program and our 8-cent transportation tax, as well as a smaller pot of money called our transportation fund. We, back in 2018, the citizens of Springfield voted to, we used to send these tax programs out to vote every 5 years. In 2018, citizens had voted to keep these programs for 20 years. So these tax programs sunset now after 20 years. So we're not having to go back every 5 years to ask the voters and the citizens to renew these taxes. So these are our primary funding sources where most of our money comes from to help fund the ADA transition plan. Our primary projects to get our plan done are our public works street maintenance budget of $1.75 million a year. And what we do with that money is we have a maintenance contract where we go out annually for a contractor to perform sidewalk and ramp work. We implemented a grinding contract. We have a contractor that I believe our annual contract is $200,000, and this just started with our transition plan. And what they do is they use horizontal grinding to grind any vertical deflections, any trip hazards that are over, they have to be under a certain deflection, of course, because they can't do anything really big with, or like where it's pushed up really far with tree roots or something. But if they are horizontal vertical deflections that are maybe over a ½ inch to an inch, the grinding contract will come in and grind those down to where they are totally flush. And then we have a service request system where citizens actually report any issues with sidewalks or ramps or any issues that they see out when they're out and about. And our public works sidewalk crew actually goes out and takes care of those service requests. If someone calls in with a service request on a sidewalk or a ramp that is not compliant and it is on a major route that someone with a disability uses, that goes to the top of our request system and takes priority over other requests that might come in. So that 1.75 million covers these 3 items, and that amount is not new. That comes out of our existing quarter-cent and 8-cent and transportation fund. So then we have our public works program, which is various funding. These are programs like our capital improvement program, which could fund large infrastructure projects. Our transportation project program, which again funds our infrastructure projects. Those are the quarter and the 8-cent that I talked about earlier. Then we have our annual overlays and any special projects that we might use STBG funds for. Anything that is done as far as ADA improvements in these programs, that is above and beyond what we estimated for our 2 million a year, or I'm sorry, for our 1.75 million a year to get our transition plan done. Our transition plan ended up being a 17-year program, meaning we started it in 2020, so it wouldn't be completed until 2037 using just the 1.75 million a year for our street maintenance. So anything above and beyond that we do with our infrastructure projects from our capital improvements and our transportation projects, our annual overlays, or any special federal funding. That is above and beyond. So we are hoping that we will get our plan done a lot sooner than 17 years. Then, as I said, we have our traffic signals, and they have their own dedicated funding, and they have a replacement program where all of our signals will be audible by a certain time. Okay, we have secondary funding sources that we can use as it becomes available. We have city council zones that have discretionary funding given to them, where a city council person can call and say, I want to use my discretionary funding for this. We've had some councilmen that call and say, I'm getting complaints about curb ramps along this street. Can I use my discretionary fund to fix those curb ramps? So again, that is something that goes above and beyond what we had dedicated. So that will help us fix things on our plan sooner than we anticipated. So again, hopefully our transition plan will not take 17 years. Then we also have STPG funding, federal funds. We've used some CDBG funding also to fix some, to do some larger type projects, and then other miscellaneous grants. Secondary type projects that we hope that will help us with our implementation plan are additional capital improvement projects that come along, as well as transportation improvement projects. I already discussed these, our annual overlays, our service requests. Also, when developers redevelop on a piece of property in the city of Springfield, if there is not sidewalk, they're required to build sidewalk. But also, if they tear up a sidewalk that is existing, they are required to rebuild that sidewalk to current ADA standards. So hopefully a lot of development, we have a lot of development going on within the city. So, and it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. We see a lot of sidewalks getting repaired and getting brought up to compliance based on these developer requirements. Utility projects, our utility is not under the city of Springfield. We have a separate utility company called City Utilities. They do a lot of gas and water renewal projects, which go right down our sidewalks. So anytime they do those projects, they are required to put the sidewalk back under current ADA standards. The city of Springfield has adopted PROAG as our standard. So anything that goes back under PROAG standards. Then we work with our local city utility. Also is our transit provider. So we just have a bus system, and we work closely with City Utilities Transit to coordinate bus stops and sidewalks to bus stops, repairing and bringing anything up at a bus stop that is not ADA compliant. We work together to get those projects done. And then again, we have grant projects. Okay, so how did we decide to implement our projects based on the results that we got back from our consultant that did our inventory and assessment? We have broken up our city into what we call map grids. What you're looking at is an example of what our map grids look like. A grid is just a certain area of the city, and it's assigned like a number. What is shown on the screen is map grid L72, L18, map grid M17, and map grid M18. So we have 26 total grids in the city of Springfield. Again, our compliance, to become fully compliant, we need $30 million, and we have budgeted $1.75 million yearly, which equals a 17-year plan. So when our consultant came back to us, they had everything prioritized by the worst need based on the assessment that came in. So in looking at where the highest priority need is and the next priority need, we would be sending crews to the southeast part of the city. The next priority need, when they were done with that, might be in the northeast part of the city. So it didn't make sense from being an effective and efficient way to handle things, considering mobilization, going from one end of the city, packing up and going to the next end of the city, just because those were the highest priority needs. So we tweaked that just a little bit. Oh my gosh, I got ahead of myself. I always do this when I present slides. What you're looking at here is actually showing you a small or a bigger portion of the map and showing if we did what the consultant said, the high ratings, it was an inefficient workflow, we would be doing a priority 1 down in the southeast side of the city and a priority 2 going to the northwest side, priority 3 going to the northeast side, and then maybe into the central part of the city. So as you can tell, we would be moving around a lot and wasting time with mobilization. Okay, so let me get back to what I was saying. So we at the city internally took a look at this and said, how can we make this more efficient for our work crews, save some money, but yet still hit high priority areas first? So we decided that our priorities in general, our top priorities would be tripping hazard and no ramps. We were going to look at those areas first based on the data that came in from our consultant, and also higher pedestrian activity areas. So what we did was we were able to make our implementation plan to where we're moving more efficiently across the city, but yet addressing the highest priority needs. So now our priority 1 and priority 2 and priority 3 and priority 4s, the first 4 years, we will be moving, like in the first year, we will be moving within the same map grid. Instead of going from one map grid down here, the next project is in another map grid in a whole other part of town. So I'm hoping I'm making sense, because I'm making sense in my head, but sometimes I don't seem to make sense when I talk. Okay. So we are implementing and working on our transition plan. Is that it? No, that is not it, because it is extremely important that we track everything that we do, so we don't just end up with a snapshot in time and we actually know the work we are doing. We know we are working on our transition plan. We know we are getting somewhere. So all of our work is tracked in our city system is an inventory and asset management system called Infor. Any permit that is issued for sidewalk work, for outside, like for developers or for a residential person maybe wanting to redo their sidewalk, any permit that is issued for sidewalk work, we track. Any infrastructure project and right of way, we have our inspectors track. I was talking earlier about the city utility water and gas line renewals that they do in our sidewalk right of way. Those are tracked by permits. So all of these permits go into our system, work orders are generated, and we ensure that the staff that is responsible for managing that project or inspecting that project enters into the system, into our inventory management system, that sidewalk has been completed and is now ADA compliant. So we have a lot of staff involved in making sure that we are tracking all of this. We have our construction inspectors, our permit inspectors, any project manager that is working on a capital improvement project that involves our right of way, our street maintenance personnel that are on our sidewalk crew, and then myself as the ADA coordinator, I try to make sure that we are getting this done. It's also important that we have accountability. We want to be transparent. Support from our disability advocates is critical. They are highly involved in our process. We review our ADA transition plan every year. Of course, it's only been 1 year or in our second year, but we reviewed it at the end of last year to see if we needed to do any revisions, and we did. I'll just talk about this a little bit. It's probably going to be on the next slide, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. Of course, we started our implementation plan in 2020, and soon after that, the pandemic hit. We did not get very far on our transition plan at all due to being shut down, due to a lot of people unable to work because of COVID. Our contractor that we had for doing our maintenance contract that was working in the first map grid, they had a lot of turnover, a lot of missing crews. So we had to take a look at what we needed to do to make this go better. We decided that we were only letting a contract for maintenance at $1 million. $1 million sounds like a lot to me and you, but it's not a lot to bigger contractors that have more than one crew that they can dedicate to working on just our ADA transition plan. So we have tossed around the idea of, well, first of all, we let a bigger contract this year. We let a $3 million contract. We took some more money, switched some pots of money around, and we're able to get better bids from bigger contractors who, again, can dedicate a crew full time on our ADA transition plan or have 2 crews working. So we are trying that this year. And also we are looking at possibly doing a bigger contract and doing something like a design build type contract. We are in the early stages of that. But we just know that, especially our experience with the pandemic last year, we've realized that we need to put more money in and to be able to attract the contractors that, again, can put the necessary manpower in to be able, because we have a lot of work to do. Like I said early on, we have 60% of our sidewalks aren't compliant and 70% of our curb ramps. So we are in the early discussions of talking about some sort of bigger design build contract to see how that's going to work. So back to accountability. I am starting to do an ADA accountability report. I haven't gotten it done this year, but this will be the first year it will be published, and it's going to be for the prior year's work. So the public will know how we are doing. And I think it also helps us internally to keep an eye on how we are doing and reaching our implementation plan goals. Lessons learned. Wow, I'm talking a lot. Okay, I'm wrapping up. Lessons learned. It is so critical to have supportive top management. Sometimes, well, a lot of times they don't know what we need as far as getting an ADA transition plan. They don't know the requirements. They don't know that cities are getting sued because they are not doing what they were required to do 30 plus years ago. They're busy. Accessibility probably isn't on the top of their radar, but I just kept I bugged them. I eventually just started sending our public works director articles where cities were getting lawsuits against them. And this is what finally opened their eyes. And they said, we need to get this done now. So I immediately started getting a lot of support and what I needed to get things done. You also need to have support of city council. When I took this to city council, not a single one was against it, of course. Who wouldn't be when you're talking about accessibility? Communication is critical. There are so many people that we need to communicate with internally. You've got to communicate internally before you can even begin to have something successful. Sometimes that communication, you don't always get what you want, and you have to keep, you might have to revise and communicate differently, but don't give up. Be flexible. There's no right or wrong way. I will tell you that when I first started this, I thought I needed to collect every piece of data out there whenever our consultant was beginning to collect our inventory. Luckily, they talked me into collecting less. You don't have to have every single little bit of information. If you do, you're going to have so much data, you're not going to know what to do with it. We narrowed it down to just a few items we wanted collected. We still had a lot of data, some which we didn't need. So be flexible, be creative, always be thinking of different ways that what will work for your community, because what works for one might not work for another one. I did a lot of research on other communities. I made phone calls. I also involved my outer lying communities, different cities that are in our metropolitan area. I wanted them to be a part of the process. I had selfish reasons for doing so because I heavily advocate for transition plans, not only in Springfield, but in surrounding communities, because I like to look at accessibility on a regional level. I only have jurisdiction within my city limits, but accessibility does not stop at my city limits. So I feel it's so important to continue on with your surrounding communities as well. So I involved them in my process as well. And that also lit the fire under them to, we need to get our transition plan done. So we all kind of worked together as a team, and we still bounce things off of each other. So if you have surrounding communities, involve them if you can. Tracking your progress is critical. And of course, I had to throw this in there because don't start an implementation during a pandemic because it was brutal. Okay, I am done, and I'm sorry, I think I went over my time. So any questions?
So thank you, Dawn. That was a great presentation. I do have a couple questions for you.
Okay.
So does the city include on-street parking and bus stops in their ADA transition plan?
We have on-street parking. It is not in our transition plan. We are in the process of inventorying our on-street parking, and it will be rolled into our transition plan because we have some issues.
Okay. And did you assess the other city infrastructure, like the city-owned buildings and parks, and include it in this transition plan, or?
Nope, that is separate, and we are actually working on that as we speak. I was always told we had a facilities transition plan, so I was just focused on rights of way. When I got done with the rights of way plan, I wanted to collect everything and put it together in one spot. And the transition plan I was given for facilities is not a transition plan. So I immediately started that process. We've gotten our inventory done, and I just need to sit down and get our plan done.
Okay. Thank you
Does that
so much.
help?
That does help. I think a lot of people are in the same situation.
Yeah, it's crazy. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Dawn.
Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from Emily Burns. And Emily Burns has worked in public service for over 25 years. Since 2008, she has served as a strategic advisor with the Seattle Department of Transportation's Asset and Performance Management Program. Emily has been actively involved with the Transportation Research Board since 2016 and has served on the Asset Management Conference Committee. Emily holds a BA from Seattle University in Public Administration and is a certified project management professional. She is the author of Seattle DOT's Transportation Status and Condition Report and managed the 2017 Sidewalk Assessment Project, which covered over 2,300 miles of sidewalks and improved the department's ADA accessibility goals. So please let's welcome Emily Burns.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa and Brad. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm really pleased to be here to talk with you about Seattle's ADA transition plan. I have to say, accessibility is a topic that has been very near and dear to my heart. And I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you about where we've come in our journey over the last, since '91, but generally since from my time about 2007. So I'm going to start with some high-level details about the city of Seattle and the region, and then I'm going to drill a little bit further into our ADA transition plan history, and then further into two assets that I work on closely, and those are sidewalks and curb ramp. Those are the ones I'm going to cover for the transition plan items. So the city of Seattle is about 53,000 and very hilly acres with some challenging topology, which means sometimes it's really challenging for us to then build curb ramps that are compliant due to the hills and other conflicts. 25% of the city is right of way, or 27%, I'm sorry, is right of way. The city of Seattle's Department of Transportation has 950 employees. And we also utilize the Infor system, or IPS, Infor for Public Service. The version we have is 11.1, and in our database right now, we have just under 500,000 assets. So that's a lot of data to maintain. The program I work with, the Asset Management Program, started in 2007. And for those of you that aren't familiar, don't have that potentially in your city, it helps us to establish an inventory of what we have, where it is, what condition it's in, and then allows us to model some maintenance and replacement projections. And we use things like risk and life cycle analysis to do that modeling. And so I've worked pretty heavily on the inventory side. And for us, we're only looking at fixed assets, the roads, the bridges, the sidewalks, curb ramps, and the like. And we currently have 49 different asset types that have been categorized. Our asset valuation for 2020 is over 28 billion. And we've seen that almost triple since we've started building an inventory of these assets. And a lot of that has to do with new types of assets, new assets that are being added, better understanding about what we have and the conditions and what it takes. Then the replacement costs, construction costs have grown significantly in this very tight city due to a number of issues. And as you can see right up at the top, our top valued item are our sidewalks and curb ramps at $94 billion. One thing I would note here, though, is we have some quasi-relationships between ownership and responsibility in terms of who is responsible for replacing the sidewalks. And it's very challenging at times to implement our revised Code of Washington, our Seattle Municipal Code. And so the city often ends up taking on a lot of that liability or responsibility depending on the situation. In 2016, the city approved a levy to move Seattle. It was the largest in the city's history. And at $930 million, it also allowed us to leverage different grant opportunities. Now, funding, I'm not going to list them all. We have 41 different funding sources with a wide variety of flexibility or inflexibility that have particular purposes. One of the largest projects we have going on right now is the city's waterfront, which is adjacent to a new seawall that was recently constructed. And that project is at well over $500 million. And it has a lot of benefits, public benefits in terms of a boulevard and trees and park-like structures, places for gathering, places for entertainment, music, and different engagement activities. The image to the right of my slide is a picture of that Seattle waterfront, and you can see that our Seattle ferries come in at that location, and there's just a lot of activity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our history, where the ADA transition plan history. In 1991, the city had its first ADA program coordinator and completed its city departments completed a self-evaluation and made some changes to discriminatory practices. And then developed a transition plan, particularly around changes to facilities. In 2007, there was an initial sidewalk and curb ramp inventory that was obtained, and that was part of the asset management program that I work with. And then in 2013, the Department of Justice asked us to look at our practices between 92 and 2012, and we found 5,000 ramps that either needed remediation or to be constructed, or that would have been constructed, that should have been triggered under projects, because there were different understandings in the department about what would have triggered those projects. One example is like a mill and overlay. My understanding is that the department others may not have known that type of work would have constituted ramp reconstruction or remediation. So our huge push forward in ADA compliance came as we started our self-evaluations of our existing assets. And we looked at our curb ramp assets from 2015 to 2016. In 2017, we performed a citywide assessment, sidewalk assessment, that validated our existing sidewalk data and then obtained barrier information. I'm going to talk quite a bit more about that later in my presentation. In 2015, we also hired our ADA coordinator, a dedicated ADA coordinator, and who helped quite a bit with a lot of that work. And unfortunately for us, we recently, COVID had a number of casualties. We lost our ADA coordinator last year. I'm sorry, at the beginning of this year. And so we've been hiring a new position, a new person for that position. In 2017, we settled a multi-year, we've been mediating for multiple years with the Reynoldson attorneys, plaintiffs' attorneys, a class action lawsuit. That lawsuit was then approved by the Department of Justice as a curb ramp consent decree. I heard Dawn talk about what it was like, that there are cities that are getting sued for their practices. We went through it. I don't recommend it to anybody, but it does cause a large spotlight on your ADA infrastructure. And that in itself has been very helpful for advocates. However, it has been also very costly for us and has taken a lot of staff time where we really want to be able to work on the assets and implement and build these assets. So in 2020, we published our first ADA transition plan for the City of Seattle right-of-way. It was referred to as the ADA transition plan, and it's intended to help and prioritize accessibility improvements and where they may need to be added for pedestrian use. The report includes methods, schedules, and reports of barrier removal And then we work really closely with the public, including organizations serving people with disabilities, to help prioritize pedestrian improvements where they may be needed for access. And what we're trying to do is that, looking at lessons learned, is really building on these early wins, getting that momentum, the education, the training. And COVID has had its own category where we have turnovers of staff. We don't get to have those elevator conversations as much, those water cooler conversations. We miss a lot of that. So we're continuing to do training, we're continuing to do outreach, but it has and continues to be a culture shift in how we do business. I'm going to talk a little bit about the consent decree itself. For us, it's an 18-year agreement, and it includes building 1,250 ramps annually. We do have a little bit of flexibility there. We have a deficit bank and we have a credit bank. And so when we were facing the pandemic and not quite knowing how we were going to implement all this work, how many private ramps are going to be built or other agency ramps are going to be built because of revenue issues or resource issues. We had a lot of staff that had to be pulled out of the field because they were high risk with COVID. And I was really thrilled at the end of the year. We built 1,212 ramps that were ADA compliant. When at the beginning of the first quarter, we were anticipating around 900 due to a number of delayed projects. One of the things that helped us to do that was doing a field fit design rather than having them all designed by our engineers and then fed into the hopper. We identified locations that were of high priority along some non-arterials or places that we knew we could get in very easily and construct because they weren't major construction hubs. And then our crews went through and they had an engineer on board that would work with them in the field to construct the ramps and answer questions very, very quickly. The cost of our ramps, we estimate, including hard and soft costs, is between $15,000 and $25,000, depending on who's building it. So they do get very, very costly and have, it definitely affects our project budgets. We have to construct a minimum of 150 customer service requested ramps, and those come from people living with disabilities or advocates or caretakers for people who are living with disabilities. We are targeting a minimum of 150, but we are constantly trying to get above that as funding is available. We maintain our database to make sure that those ramps are reflected, and then the information gets pushed out into maps, which I'll share later. There's a whole resource pages and map pages at the end of my presentation. And the database has a lot of information in it, including all of our curb ramp data, just the asset information, the inspection reports, photos, and then the other piece of the MEF form, so we can show why and how it was deemed to be MEF compliant. Now, for us, I talked a little bit about our challenging topology, but there might be locations where they're structurally impractical or technically infeasible. And in this case, we define we have the engineer of record do the maximum extent feasible and define why and basically defend why. Some of it might also be due to right-of-way availability, drainage impacts, and utility structures or faults. Let's see here. So we also maintain an ADA coordinator position for the Department of Transportation. This position is required by the consent decree. The consent decree further requires that we do forecasting and reporting related to the curb ramp construction and when we believe these ramps are going to be constructed and how SDOT has the toggle to sort of turn things on and off and what we anticipate are going to be built in future years. And one of the things that's been incredibly valuable for us are the public outreach efforts. We had a public access advisory committee, which before COVID was very active, and we were able to directly relate and work with folks that live in our communities, work in our communities, who are living with disabilities or older adults. We would talk to them about multiple issues, anywhere from policies to how our maintenance practices were being implemented. Snow and ice response was a big one, all the way to specific locations for improvements. The image on the right-hand side of this slide is our director's rule for right-of-way openings and restoration. And we have a goal here to clearly define what alterations versus maintenance trigger those curb ramps, making sure that everybody is on the same page with expectations. This is one of our major lessons learned from the period between 1992 to 2012. You know, what needs to be constructed and where. And so there's some great diagrams in here to help designers understand those requirements. And then we also have things like a compliant curb ramp map that they can go and see, oh, we know that ramps have been constructed in this area, they've deemed to be compliant, or there was the self-survey that deems it to be compliant, so we don't have to include those, but we still require that they do complete measurements. The next slide I'm showing here is our Seattle standard plans and specifications. The image on the left is the front cover for our 2020 edition. And the image on the right is a plan sheet for a standard ramp plan. This is our most typical single ramp that is the 422. We consider the 422A ramp. When we first had these specific designs, these plans, there were only 2, and now we've expanded it to 12. Not because there were changes to ramp requirements, but just to have a lot more information available to help designers when they're looking at different right-of-way conflicts. The next slide covers our asset and work management data. I mentioned earlier that we use the M4 system for both that asset and work management. We want to get that history on each specific asset, so that's where work management comes in. We have inspection data that is maintained separately in a GIS database, which allows people to go out in the field and use an application called CREA, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's in GIS, and it's then uploaded as an attachment to the asset record. The ramp data, including pictures, inspection sheet, they're all stored as attachments. And then one of the things I love to be able to do is not just say, okay, this thing is sitting in a database somewhere and we know how many or what type we have, but where is it? Every time I go and talk to people that live in or work in the city, they you know, we give them the big picture and talk about the picture, but what they really want to know is what's in my area, what is accessible to me, and what is close to my home often. So those maps are incredibly helpful to allow us to tell that story. This is an image of an iPad. We use iPads quite a bit, but the tool that we use is also available on different types of tablets or mobile phones. Anything that's got Wi-Fi and can download the Collector app, you've got it. It's going to work for you. We call it CREA, and we wanted to make sure the acronym worked, and that CREA is actually a baby llama, so that's pretty cute. I love to show the baby llama, and then people sort of remember it in their heads. Oh yeah, it's that baby llama tool. It's used to inspect every single ramp that is constructed in the right-of-way. And I often talk to folks about, well, it doesn't really matter if you just build the ramp. We have to make sure it's compliant, and the way that we make sure it's compliant, the way we get it into our system, is through this application. It's based off of GIS Collector with a Survey 123. And as I mentioned, it's available on those different devices. The next slide talks about the development goals. We had a version 1 and we're now in version 2. And so we really wanted to improve our curb ramp and sidewalk asset data maintenance, data management. And it helps to improve the locations through coordinate based. Before we just had them at the end of the line. Now we can actually put these assets where they belong. It allows us to sustainably track ramps at a variety of phases, from planning all the way through construction, closeout, and then operations. I talked a little about maintenance. We want to know when maintenance is being performed. And then it helps us to accurately report the curb ramp build out. And then that is really key and critical for us to support the consent decree. I'm going to show an image of the inspection report on the right. You can see there's a unique identifier for every single ramp. Locations, it shows it on a map. So if you're in the wrong place or your GPS isn't properly triangulated, you can confirm that you're not sitting in the right place. And so the map is incredibly helpful. It includes all the code values from the asset inventory, but also a lot of technical data. And then it's really cool. We've developed it so that our inspection values change based upon the type of ramp that's being constructed. So if an inspector is not required to obtain a certain type of data based upon that ramp type, they don't have to see it. They can just focus on what they need to know. The other key piece for us is the MEF, when it triggers MEF review, and that is when the values are out of compliance. You're seeing the ramp category if there's a detectable warning. If it says there is not a detectable warning, that's one of the values that is going to trigger a big red, statement that this is going to require a ramp review. I'm giving you a couple of context photos because these are what our consent decree has required. So the curb ramp context is on the right, I'm sorry, the left-hand side, and then the running slope photo is on the right. The inspection form is identified here. It's a sort of small, so we'll be able to, I think, provide the slides at the end so you can look through all the different values that we track. And as I mentioned, this is included with every single ramp. So if someone is looking at our data or looking at our maps on the internal side, they'll be able to go and actually find that particular ramp. Planning is a big piece for us. So we enter all of the ramps into our asset management database as planned. And then that allows us to track the locations. So if we're dealing with construction conflicts, or we need to know when things are going to be built so that we can see, are we going to meet our 1250 consent decree deliverables, we can toggle on and we can toggle back. And displays on those interactive maps and the dashboards. We've just developed a really cool dashboard that's both for our executive dashboard and then also an inspector dashboard. And again, really helpful in our consent decree target planning. And we are required to report annually to the plaintiff's attorneys in a very, very large report, but it also allows us to do some weekly tracking. This is a screenshot of our dashboard. It shows the target. Are we meeting the goal currently? And you can see that, yes, we're in the summer and we're seeing pretty good ramp construction. It has a map of those locations. And then there's additional information in the dashboard about planning and what ramps have been built by which projects. So now I'm going to move over to the sidewalk assessment. This was a project I was notified sort of at the last minute. We got a last minute budget addition from City Council. There were some huge advocates, particularly our pedestrian advisory board, that wanted to see us not just look at where sidewalks were missing, but what was the condition of our existing sidewalks. So I had a $400,000 to use and had to figure out how to do that very effectively and efficiently. But that also meant that not all costs were included in that budget. My time in particular was not covered, and I was on overhead. So I had 14 interns, a project engineer, and a coordinator, a day-to-day GIS coordinator that helped track the information and work directly with our staff. So it allowed us to do this self-assessment, this validation of what the barriers were. And we looked at existing attributes to validate them. And then we built out a system-wide list of different obstructions, height differences, cross slopes, etc. We established condition ratings and updated all of the asset information in our database. It included a lot of different, but I mentioned the collection tools, the system improvements, the data uploads, because none of that was minor. Those were really significant issues that we had to deal with, and we had a big project team from many different stakeholders internally in the city. And then we built out a project report with recommendations. We looked at over 34,000 blocks, had 155,000 observations, the biggest being height differences. And there were 93,000 of those that were observed. The sidewalk is in the city, 2,300 miles. And then we identified that needed repairs, low to high estimate was half a billion to 1.3 billion. The condition results are displayed here, with good being the highest quantity at 41%, but we also had a lot of excellent sidewalks, and those are ones that are pretty new and have no issues whatsoever. They are absolutely compliant. And then you'll see the poor and very poor. The next slide is how we define those conditions. So we looked at observable issues, but we also looked at things like the cross slope. If something fit, for instance, between a 6 and 8% primary cross slope, if there weren't issues, that didn't matter. It already fell into that poor bucket. So that's an example. But the scores detracted based upon the number of issues and how much of the sidewalk we anticipated had to be replaced. I wanted to give an example of some obstruction types that folks who are typically able-bodied may not have as much of an issue with, but those who are living in a wheelchair or are using canes or different devices for sight disabilities. These things are incredibly challenging to get through, wheeled devices. And so it's trying to help people perception and build the perception about how important it is to remove these types of obstructions from the right-of-way, especially those that are very easy to do. After building this assessment out and the data that I showed you, we're able to defend the need for additional funding. And before, our program was customer service driven. The performance measure was, we got a customer phone call and our engineer would go out and look at the site. They might spray paint it or put a cone on it and determine who was responsible, property owner or the city, and then go through a whole series of notifications. And we don't have a lot of sticks, so it's the carrots, and many property owners did not respond. So it just wasn't really getting at the type of performance that we want to see. Did we actually do anything? Did we make a change? Did we change the pedestrian environment and make it more accessible? So we used asphalt shims and other methods for mitigation, and then as funding became available, we went ahead and repaired areas. Now, what happens is we have a proactive prioritization model that is for maintenance and replacement needs, and it allows us to look at density and target locations based upon a number of factors. We get to pursue partnering opportunities with other agencies, both internal and external, and then develop a 3 to 5 year capital plan so that we can show how we would program those needs. That helps us continue to defend funding, grant opportunities, and any other opportunities that come our way, because we're shovel ready and we can go. It still continues to support customer service requests. However, and the other piece of this is claims response. If we get a notification of a claim, we go out and address it. And we're just continuing to develop improvements to how we notify our property owners and how we enforce with our property owners, and then identifying areas of very heavy vegetation occlusion. The map on the right-hand side shows the grid-based system that we were able to develop that now becomes a very proactive model. If given enough funding over a 5-year time span, we can go and cover all of these areas to do proactive shimming and beveling. The way that we do this is we look for we build data-driven decision making. And so we have a number of layers on our maps, and we do buffer analyses on density, the severity of issues, cost, mobility impairments, and then we build this usage density, which I'm really excited about. We pull this from the ADA guidance for a quarter-mile proximity to things like government services. Is there a school there, or a community center, a park? We look for transit access, again, schools, medical centers, senior living facilities, retail, employment, and then residential. And we built a weighted measure so that the items at the top get the highest scoring and residential gets the lowest scoring. And then we are looking at equity. By knowing what we have, where it is, our conditions, we can build in equity to our decision-making processes. We've developed a sidewalk observation tool that allows us then to update those issues when they've been mitigated or repaired. Our proactive efficiencies have allowed us to, again, defend the budget. You can see back at 2017-16, we're averaging about 1.7 million. 2019 was our big jump up. A lot of that had to do with schools funding from red light cameras. And then 2020, we had a dip with COVID. Thank you, COVID. Very, very challenging, but we're continuing to push forward. And then we changed our performance measure. It was no longer, did we go out and look at it? It was, what did we do? So I'm gonna talk a little bit about our accomplishments in the next slide. I wanted to share this quote from one of our engineers, because as many of us are dealing with in cities, there are so many sidewalks. What do I do? Where do I go first? And the data-driven decision-making models and the prioritization really help them to compartmentalize the information and use the data to feel like we're getting our biggest bang for the buck. Because with customer service, we were going from this side of the city to this side of the city, and trucks, vehicles, equipment, labor, very, very expensive. If we can basically isolate that in a general area, we get better economies of scale. And we also use a beveling contractor as Springfield does. So our crews also felt more invested because of the grid managed system. They felt like they could make sense and they could make their own decisions. We weren't just telling them to go one location or another. They got the entire grid to make their decisions how to do their work. So over 2019, we completed almost 30 blocks of sidewalk replacement. That's equivalent to 2,000 square feet of repairs and well over 12,000 spot improvements, removing those trip hazards. To put this in context, before 2018, we did about 1,000 annually, and those were all around that customer service request. So it's a huge, huge improvement to how we do our business. And then 2020, we had a bit of a dip, as I mentioned, over 15 block equivalents of sidewalk replacement, and then just under 6,000 of sidewalk spot repairs. And as of for 2020, I'm seeing well past that 6,000 number just within the first 2 quarters of those spot improvements. So I'm rounding out my presentation with a series of like a resource library for you to utilize. I've included the ROAR, the right-of-way restorations rule, the ADA transition plan link, our ADA requests website for how our folks that would like to see curb ramps or other aspects of the right-of-way changed to help with their mobility. Our sidewalk assessment project link is here, as well as the asset and performance management site and some of the tools that we work on to build better driven data decision making. And then the last one on the page is our moving the needle report. There's some great data stories in here about our pedestrian infrastructure and how we track and measure performance. Finally, I'm providing some links for our external web maps. I love maps, so I think they're pretty cool. You know, again, if we know what we have or it is, we can start to map, we can symbolize on these things that are important to our public, our engineers, you name it, our executives. Knowing what we have where it is incredibly helpful. And those maps get updated typically on a weekly basis because we're regularly updating our asset databases. So we have our assets link at the top. I mentioned the compliant and planned curb ramp maps earlier in my presentation. And then finally, we have the Seattle Accessible Route Planner. And the concept behind this was helping people to see the accessibility across the city in terms of what assets were available, their condition, so sidewalks and curb ramp condition. We also took into account street slopes, marked crosswalks. We utilize our traffic signals. People are often more comfortable crossing at traffic signals. And then access to different facilities. You know, where can I find a restroom? You know, where's the closest park? Where's the closest community center? And things like that, and transit access. So that rounds out the end of my presentation. Again, I'm Emily Burns. I am the Asset Management Strategic Advisor with the Seattle Department of Transportation, and I'll take any questions. I've gone ahead and put my information here in case you have questions later, or you'd like more technical details or materials.
Thank you, Emily. That was a great presentation. We all learned a lot. I have a couple questions for you. You showed, one of your slides showed a picture of trash receptacles and a lot of overgrown vegetation that was obstructing the sidewalk. Has the city done a self-evaluation and really reviewed their policies and made any changes to policies that sort of generically affect accessibility in the right of way?
Yes, and I'm trying to. I can't recall right some of the names of those policies, but I can follow up. A lot of this, the policies may already be there around accessibility, and sometimes what happens is we have to build awareness to go to help people to find where those policies are. So we continue to work on our curb ramp, our curb ramp design policies and construction policies, but also we work very closely with our Seattle Public Utilities, who manages the garbage receptacles, so that they can then work with the abutting property owner to make sure that they can put them in a more accessible location.
Okay, that's great. I know a lot of times they're policies, it's just a matter of implementation and enforcement. Okay.
And training, education, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's a big piece, you know, and knowledge management, knowledge sharing is so huge here. We utilize SharePoint site, and then a lot of different internal websites, but also external websites. One of the things, I have a good example of a policy that we've changed, our snow removal policy. We had a advocacy group in the Seattle area. We experienced a pretty significant, I think we called it snowpocalypse, a few years ago. And what was happening is we weren't seeing sidewalks being cleared. And when the trucks were plowing the snow, they would put the snow right in the curb ramp. And so we changed a lot of our policies in that way, where you have these temporary obstructions and then helping people to think about how hard it is to navigate the right of way in those scenarios and situations.
Thank you. I know snow removal is a big deal for a lot of people. So when a city has a curb ramp or a sidewalk where it's technically infeasible to make them entirely accessible, how do you track that in your database?
We have, well, I would say that I'll give you a good example. Areaways. We have this thing called an areaway. So I think Chicago is very similar. At some point, the city's stories were raised by one floor, and then they placed the roadway in the middle. And what ended up happening is there used to be these ladders, and so you would go up over the roadway, and then you cross, and then go back down. And this was all sort of in the Pioneer Square and downtown area. There was a lot of issues with drainage and sewer, septic, traffic issues that were pretty mucky. And so what happened is that they built these area ways that then were these open spaces down below. Now that's a structural member, and it's very expensive. It could be about $1 million per sidewalk to repair. And so we identify that area way is down below, and there's a structural member below, but there are still times where that gets triggered depending on the adjacent construction activity.
Okay, thank you. So we have one last poll question, and while I'm pulling up the poll, feel free to add questions to the chat. We have a lot of questions already, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. And I am just seeing the first poll here, Brad. There we go. So our second poll asks about how does your agency use ADA transition plan? And select all of them that apply. And if you have something really interesting to share that you think others would benefit from, feel free to add that to the chat so that we can all learn from this. Okay, looks like we still have a few coming in. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling. And so it looks like 57, almost 60% of people are using it for project development and design. So that is a great use, 50% for long range planning. STIP and TIP kind of goes in with the long range planning, but it looks like everybody's utilizing their transition plan the way it's meant to be. So good job, everybody. And so now we're going to open it up to questions for both Dawn and Emily. And so I have a couple questions for both of you while we wait for other questions to come in. I've got one that's come up in the other questions pretty frequently, and that is, how do you reach out to the public, specifically to people who have disabilities? And what's been the most beneficial information that you've gotten from that discussion? And how do you keep people involved? So Dawn, you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. I reach out to people with disabilities. I mostly use, we have a local independent living center called Empower Abilities. And that is how I began reaching out. And that's how I've received most of my, the people that I communicate with regularly. They have their own advocacy team called Team Access. And that is a group of people with disabilities that they meet once a month there. And sometimes they'll go out and they'll have field trips and they will assess sidewalks and curb ramps. They also do a lot of assessment inside businesses and restaurants. So I have paired up with them, and I have what I call my city ADA committee. I meet with them every other month, and in conjunction with them, we talk about the issues that they see, or that they've seen, and I take that information back and work within the city to get issues taken care of. Did that answer all the questions?
Yep. What's the most beneficial thing that the disability community brought to the table?
Oh gosh, there has been a lot. I think the most beneficial thing for me has been the issues that, okay, I'll just use this for an example. We do not require businesses that restripe parking lots to get a permit. Therefore, any parking lot that is restriped is not inspected for accessibility. And we have a lot of complaints coming in that that parking lots are not providing accessible spaces, or the access aisles aren't right, or they have a parking spot in front of the access aisle curb, things of that nature. So that really opened my eyes, and we are in turn are just starting the process for developing a permit for and requiring anyone in the city that restripes a parking lot to require them to get a permit. So that might seem minor to a lot of people out there, but that's been huge for us at the city of Springfield.
Thank you. Emily, how do you reach out to the public, especially disability community, and keep them involved, and what benefits have they brought to the table?
I would say it primarily through the group I mentioned is the Pedestrian Access Advisory Committee, where we were meeting quarterly with them, and we have a Lighthouse for the Blind organization, so we have a direct conduit with them. There's another group in our region called Disability Rights Washington. This has been incredibly valuable, but we're working both, with people who are living with disabilities as well as older adults, and just having that conversation back and forth and being able to really understand what it's like to navigate certain sections of the right-of-way. When we did the sidewalk assessment, we did a survey and we reached out and we got a lot of feedback about whether the terms we were using were easily understandable, but also were there things that we weren't going to be tracking from an engineer's standpoint that more, that really needed to be more leveled out for different purposes, so there'd be more layman's terms. One of the things that we also utilized were our ADA coordinator got a wheelchair, cane devices, and sight devices to occlude sight, and then had our engineers navigate an intersection to what that experience was like once you start to put those blinders on. And that was I think really helpful in having our engineers and designers really understand what they were designing in the right of way and what it meant to traverse those areas. I mentioned the snow removal project. Disability Rights Washington was really helpful in working with the city on how to change that. So they brought the issue up, and they didn't just stop there with bringing up the issue. They worked with us to do a video and worked on getting the word out to our public, to show what it was like and have people who are living in wheelchairs to talk about what it was like navigating those areas. And then we're hoping to do a lot of that same work with things like vegetation. Yeah, so those are a couple ways that have been really helpful.
Okay. We're actually at the bottom of the hour. So Brad, do we have time to get one more question in each? Okay. So
We can go ahead. We are right at the bottom of the half hour, but
okay. So a question for Dawn. You talked about when you evaluated your curb ramps, you started with a lot of details and then decided some things were not as important as other things. What elements did you decide were not as important and why?
When you look at the toolkit that is put out by, I can't even, is that put out by?
Department of Justice.
Yes. And it lists things to collect. You can collect so much data that you have data overload. And basically all you really need to know is it compliant or is it not? But things that were important to us to actually collect were, of course, running slope, cross slope, tripping hazards, obstructions, sidewalk width, ramp width, the major things. Things like gutter slope, if it's a wing ramp or a return curb ramp. Those minor things we didn't feel like we really needed to collect. So we just pared everything down to the basics and what was important for us to keep track of. Again, I will say that I fought it every step of the way. And I thought even at inspection of a new sidewalk or a repaired sidewalk, I wanted every single section of sidewalk collected with data. But in working with my construction inspectors, I didn't realize in my head how much time that would take. So we do like spot checks, and then in our inventory system, we do the main things we want to see, like width and cross slope and running slope, and then a checkbox, is it compliant? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Really quickly, Emily, how do you factor equity into your prioritization process?
So we utilize we have council districts, but then we move into the census tracts, and we identify people of color in addition to non-English speakers, and we have those scales sort of rated high down to low. And so what we're trying to do is look at past practices. By having work order data and information, we can then see where we may not have gone out and done work. One of the things that we learned through our Race and Social Justice Initiative was that often people who were calling were typically more affluent or Caucasian in wealthier neighborhoods, and services were being diverted to those areas because they knew to call and ask for help. So this goes back to just knowing that you know the data that you have and utilizing that data to make decisions rather than waiting for people to come to you and ask for something to be done.
Great. Thank you. And that's an awesome practice. So contact information is on the screen. If you have unanswered questions, feel free to contact our presenters. And Dawn is D-A-W-N-E. You got demoted to Dwayne again.
All the time. It's all right.
This has been a great discussion. Thank you, Emily and Dawn, for participating. The webinar has been recorded and will be posted in the future. Special thanks to our speakers, Dawn and Emily, and to our partners at AASHTO and the civil rights community. Please make sure to register for our last webinar, which is next week on July 21st, when the topic will be disability advisory groups involvement in LPA transition plan implementation. And it's a really good presentation. I've seen it. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. And the webinar series will be posted on Federal Highways website in the near future, and we'll let everyone know when that happens. Thank you.
Thank you.